I'm Steve Orleans, President of the National Committee on U.S. China Relations, and we're thrilled to welcome you to this somewhat different program than what we usually do. I'm pleased that we could partner with the National Committee on American Foreign Policy, and we have with us its President, Ambassador Susan Elliott. So let me turn it over to Susan for some words of welcome.
Well, thank you, Steve, and thanks to all of you who are participating today. You know, I think we were just talking about, how important this report is, progress made and lessons learned from the U.S. China Strategic and Economic Dialogue. And on behalf of, we call ourselves the other National Committee, I want to offer my thanks and appreciation to you, Steve, and to your strong team at the National Committee on U.S. China Relations. I think you have co-organized the launch of today's report. We've worked really closely together on this, and I think for all of today's participants, you're going to be really pleased at hearing the great work that the research team has done. I'd also like to recognize and thank both the American Friends Service Committee and the Ford Foundation, whose generous support and partnerships have made this research possible. So thank you to both of those organizations. And finally, I'd just like to thank the members of the research team. Steve will introduce everyone, but Tiffany Barron, Rory Daniels, who works with us at the National Committee, Patrick Hume, Daniel Jasper, Craig Kafora, and Casey Minora. Today, Tiffany, Rory, Daniel, and Susan Thornton, who also works with us at the National Committee, will be part of the panel discussion. But we also want to recognize that Craig, Casey, and Patrick played an extremely important role in this research project. So thanks to all of you for taking the time and energy to invest in this project and for being with us today to discuss your findings and experiences. So I'll turn the program back over to you, Steve, and thanks.
Thank you, Ambassador Elliott. Sometimes I wait and wait for something to arise and wait for it to come. And I keep saying, wait, this exists. I know this is right. And in this case, Engagement Revisited. This report is one I've waited for a long time. In fact, since 2017, since kind of the Security and Economic Dialogue, Strategic and Economic Dialogue was ended by the Trump administration, I've kind of waited for some great scholars to analyze what those dialogues did for the American people. And then this report appeared and I said, here it is. Hallelujah, this is exactly what I've been waiting for. So I want to thank the National Committee, the other National Committee, and Tiffany, Rory, Dan, Susan, and the whole team for writing what is a great report and what everyone needs to read. Everybody needs to read this because it's the data. So much of what we talk about in U.S. China relations is kind of vague generalities, but this is the data, and that's what we're going to hear about today. I think you can download the report now. Today is its official launch, and we're pleased to be doing it together. And you can now download it and read it. But what we're going to do in this hour and 15 minutes is give you a flavor for what is in the report and discuss some of its implications. We've got three of the authors. I will give very brief introductions. Tiffany Barron, who is a PhD candidate in the Princeton University Department of Politics, conducting research on the intersection of international relations and comparative politics. She's in her fourth year in the PhD program here. Rory Daniels, who's the co-lead of the Engagement Revisited project, and is the Deputy Project Director of the Forum on Asia-Pacific Security at the National Committee on American Foreign Policy, and Dan Jasper, the other co-lead of the Engagement Revisited project, and he is the Asia Public Education and Advocacy Coordinator for the American Friends Service Committee, where he's advocated for diplomacy, humanitarian cooperation, and peace building with North Korea and China since 2015. And of course, Susan Thornton, who in addition to being the project director of the Forum on Asia Pacific Security at the National Committee on American Foreign Policy and a visiting lecturer at Yale Law School, is the director of the National Committee on U.S. China Relations. And as I think most of the people on this call had an absolutely sterling 28-year career in the United States Department of State, where she finished as the acting assistant secretary for East Asian and Pacific Affairs, and both in and out of government has been a voice for rational China policy. So let me turn it over to Dan first. We'll do Dan, Rory, Tiffany, kind of in that order, to kind of give an overview and some of the findings. Then we'll start questions. I know we've got a lot of audience questions already. We will try to get to as many of those as possible, but let me say in advance, we are not going to be able to get to all of them. So Dan, thanks for this great work. It really, as we were talking before, it uplifted my spirits, because it's something that in the back of my mind I knew was right, and then you kind of gave us the data to show that these dialogues created real benefits for the American people.
Yeah, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Steve. I really appreciate it. And now it's my turn, I think, to extend a few thank yous. I want to thank the National Committee on U.S. China Relations for hosting this launch. We really, really appreciate it. And I also want to thank the National Committee on American Foreign Policy and the entire research team for all their contributions. I think, like all good research, this was sort of equal parts fascinating and equal parts grueling, but they bore it all well. And so much appreciation for everyone involved. I also want to thank the Carter Center. Much of this report was seeded in work I did with them for a report called Finding Firmer Ground. So we appreciate them laying the groundwork for this. Before we get into the nitty-gritty of the report, I wanted to give the sort of the why and the how of this project. Starting with the why, I think we're all familiar with the broad criticisms that engagement and dialogue didn't work with China. However, I had a lot of trouble understanding this, and I wondered, I think the same as Steve, if there was some hard data to show the impacts of engagement and dialogue with China. I didn't find much, and so I set out with the Carter Center to first see how we can evaluate these dialogues. And the first step was measuring them against their stated objectives and outputs, rather than some sort of general ideal. And we developed a sort of rough outline for how to evaluate these mechanisms. And I brought this rough outline to the National Committee on American Foreign Policy and Rory Daniels. And we came together on this point and thought, why don't we put this evaluation methods into practice? So we wanted to see if we could get a quantitative and or qualitative assessment of how well they performed as measured against their own stated goals, not some foreign policy ideal. Just a quick word on the how. We zoomed in on the strategic and economic dialogue under Obama for a few reasons. Number one, there was ample data. There's nearly 1,000 commitments made, all relatively laid out sort of neatly on joint statements, which is perfect for researchers. There was a real effort, I think, to lay these commitments in a format that could be assessed over time. And so I want to give a lot of credit to the officials that were involved in that and really took efforts to sort of meticulously document these things. Along with the ample data, it was a huge effort. The S&ED touched on probably a good chunk, the vast majority of issues between the US and China. And so we could see where there were areas that dialogue. Well, I suppose we had the question in the back of our mind, where there are areas where dialogue was more effective than others. Maybe it was only a tool that worked for certain discussions. And we wanted to explore that a little bit further, and the S&ED was a perfect grounds to do that. Another point was that ample time had passed, and we could follow the trajectory of these commitments even after the US and China stopped talking. So did these commitments evaporate after the dialogue stopped, or were there continued developments on these issues? And this period of disengagement that followed the S&ED also provides, I think, an important counterfactual in some ways. How are the US and China managing the relationship in the absence of dialogue? That abrupt stop to dialogue makes it more measurable in a sense, because it acts like a typical policy intervention that can be engaged and disengaged at will. So just a quick couple notes on our data set and project design, and I'm happy to get more into this in the Q&A because I think it could be a lengthier discussion. But we noted early on that the language within these commitments are meant to be somewhat below the level of international agreement, but above aspirational. So in other words, we had to sort through what exactly was a commitment, what was measurable as a commitment, and what was verifiable. So how does one measure something like strengthening cooperation or encouraging participation of the private sector, for example? Well, it's obviously a little subjective, but we did our best to glean from interviews and joint statements when things like that, and to see if there were areas that we could identify where subjects increased. It's also an important point, I think, for officials, because if they want to show the efficacy of these instruments, the vocabulary really does matter. And the other major point I'll mention here is the issue of verifiability. Many commitments were sort of vague, complex, and some of them touched on classified processes in which we wouldn't have been able to assess. So we indicated when we could verify commitment and made a comment when indicators weren't verifiable. So this should give you sort of a little bit of lay of the land, and we can probably dive now into some more of the specifics. And I think I can hand it off to Rory, who can talk about the key takeaways.
Thanks, Dan. And thanks, Steve, and thanks to the National Committee on U.S. China Relations for having us. So as Dan said, we went through this very complex data set of almost 1,000 outcomes to look at all of the different commitments and follow up on their progress. And in addition to using open source research to do this kind of quantitative data where we're seeing, if, for example, the U.S. committed to reducing its national debt, to what extent was that followed? What was the volume? What was the time frame in which that occurred? We also interviewed former officials who had been working particularly on negotiations in the process. So for the most part, we weren't interviewing principals or senior officials, but we were interviewing people who were doing the nitty-gritty work of developing outcomes and coming to negotiations with Chinese counterparts to see if they thought the processes were effective and efficient, and to see if there were any recommendations they had about areas of particular progress or areas in which the S&ED process could have been improved. And from those two methods of evaluating the S&ED, we came up with several key takeaways. Overall, we found that the S&ED process was effective in creating space for diplomatic progress. And there were several structural elements of the S&ED that made this possible. The S&ED was effective at bridging the gaps between the two systems, two very different types of bureaucracies. So the combination of this high-level buy-in for these dialogues, where the secretaries were going to get together once a year, ministers would get together once a year and endorse outcomes alongside the working level negotiations that were kind of continuously running throughout the year, created a really effective feedback loop for making progress on key issues. And it also bridged the gap between a relatively top-down Chinese system where the key decision makers need to give permission from the top down for working level negotiations to proceed, and the bottom-up nature of the U.S. system where working level officials were relatively free to negotiate outcomes toward a goal without getting express permission from their principals or secretaries. So the S&ED process, that combination of high-level buy-in and working-level negotiations was very effective at making progress on issues and bridging the gap between the two systems. The regular schedule of the S&ED, the idea that the meetings were going to happen every single year, regardless of other events in U.S. China relations, created also action-forcing and action-allowing mechanisms. So once again, the working level negotiations that were continuous throughout the year had their own process and logic of consolidating priorities, for example, in the US system. What were our asks of China? What did we want from China this year? And that unsiloed some of the barriers between different agencies or departments towards this action forcing event, which was this principal level meeting. On the Chinese side, the actions were allowed through this mechanism. So knowing that the principals were going to get together in the year created some momentum for working level officials to try to make progress on issues. One of the biggest takeaways that we found is that the process itself, this kind of continuous action that was going on behind the scenes, created relationships that were really important for achieving progress on critical U.S. interests. So at the beginning of the S&ED, officials we interviewed told us that at times the first step in achieving progress on an issue was actually just identifying who in the Chinese system would be responsible for taking action or making progress on that issue. And in this building of relationships and this iterative process, there were also opportunities to talk to Chinese interlocutors about issues that occurred outside the scope of the S&ED. So in some cases, these relationships were critical in resolving crises or managing areas of conflict that had nothing to do with the negotiated outcomes of the S&ED, but would not have been possible without the relationships built through this process. This process also complemented other aspects of diplomacy with China. It was never meant to be the sole mechanism by which to manage U.S. China relations, but it established itself within a rhythm of diplomacy that included high-level meetings. So there was a typical calendar of events where the S&ED would meet in the spring and the summer, followed by a leadership level meeting in the fall, perhaps at an international forum or a bilateral summit, in which, outcomes from the S&ED would be further consolidated, explained, and endorsed by the leaders. This process was also pretty effective at advancing U.S. interests. So some of the criticisms of the S&ED include that it was not, results oriented, or it was not whole of government. But I think if you look at our data set, you'll find that it is very difficult to make that case looking at the outcomes. There were many outcomes in which U.S. interests were advanced in significant ways, whether we're talking about global financial stability or bilateral trade and investment, people-to-people exchange, energy and climate change priorities, and also, international priorities, conservation, wildlife trafficking, illegal logging, and other issues. So I think the data set shows that it really was a whole of government and a results-oriented process, quite in contrast to some of the criticism of the S&ED. But all of that is not to say that it was without some criticism, including criticism from working level officials that we interviewed. So, two of the main criticisms were that the S&ED kind of hoovered up or vacuumed up progress that was not essential to its own process. So, there were ongoing mechanisms of U.S. China diplomacy that had been going on for decades. And when the S&ED was created, they fell under the umbrella of the S&ED without a logic as to why that happened, creating this kind of sprawling mechanism or issue sprawl where the S&ED was covering more than it really needed to. And I think the other major criticism was that it was overly process oriented. That when issues could not, when the US and China could not come to progress on an issue, they tended to fall back on process. So you'll see, if you look at our data set, there are many outcomes that are statements of principle. They don't necessarily create a commitment to do something different, but create a commitment to talk again about a specific issue. And although our team actually found that there was a value in having those ongoing discussions, there's plenty of criticism that says that, that in itself was not progress, and therefore some of these dialogues would need to be revisited, sunsetted, or revised. And with that, I'll turn it over to Tiffany, but those are the key takeaways and conclusions that we came to that form the basis of the policy recommendations, which Tiffany will address. Thank you.
And we'll go back after Tiffany speaks to some of the very specific deliverables that resulted from the S&ED. Go ahead, Tiffany, sorry.
Thank you, Rory, and thank you, Steve, and just also echoing thanks to the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations for hosting us. So I will speak to the policy recommendations, which in brief, our conclusion after we finished our research was that we should return to some elements of the S&ED structure, but with modifications. So we think that to build an effective U.S.-China engagement strategy that requires helping to manage cooperation, competition, and confrontation between the world's two largest powers, we need some kind of consistent, endorsable process to keep different issues in the relationship compartmentalized. So we recognize that there will be areas of competition, there will be areas of confrontation between the US and China. But in order to manage those areas while still moving forward in areas where we have common interests between the US and China, there needs to be some kind of process that sets a rhythm to the relationship. and to still find a way for these major powers to cooperate on these issues. So one of our key recommendations there is that we need high-level buy-in to the cooperative side of the agenda. As Rory mentioned earlier, these high-level summits served as action-forcing events during the S&ED. And it was clear from the interviews that people on both sides understood that negotiations had to end by each year's high-level summit. So they forced action and they forced a conclusion to negotiations. On the Chinese side in particular, the high-level sign-off also created space for lower-level officials to make progress. So this is something that's currently missing in the U.S.-China relationship. Another key component is that both sides need to manage expectations and make sure that the logic of the process itself is clear. So the logic of the process, the goal is not to change each other's systems, but to manage areas of competition and build on common interests. To that end, bilateral diplomacy should be used to identify the other side's interests and goals and leverage them to create value for your own sides. Part of managing expectations then is building more monitoring mechanisms into the process, being more clear about what counts as an outcome, so what is agreed to through the process and what is an output, what occurs over time. We also suggest to differentiate the outcomes by type rather than lumping them all into a single comparative list by topic. So the S&ED formerly would release a list of outcomes, and it would be a single list, and it would be divided by, say, climate change or by health, infectious disease, purely by topic. But when we actually went through and looked at the outcomes, we found that you could categorize the outcomes as by type as things like statements of principle, agreement signed, ongoing progress, new projects, etc. So being clear about what these specific outcomes are and then how they occur over time would be helpful for resurrecting a new S&ED type process. We also recommend that the two sides continue to break down silos among different agencies, actors, and beneficiaries of the process. Along with that, an interagency process to consolidate or an oversight mechanism to consolidate how the different agencies are relating to each other. Something that came out in interviews, in several interviews, is that the S&ED didn't have a sunsetting mechanism for dialogues. So when a dialogue no longer fit the priorities or the interests of both sides, very often the dialogue would continue to meet. We recommend that a new process would reduce the administrative and logistical burden by having some kind of sunsetting mechanism to recognize when a dialogue was no longer necessary. To that end, we recommend that a new process would prioritize the issues that need an S&ED style process in order to continue or to bear fruit.
Great. Well, let's bring it now from kind of the process, the discussion at 30,000 feet down to, okay, we're having an argument. What are the specific deliverables? There's an enormous amount of government expense and effort and cabinet secretary's time and all these things. Talk about specific deliverables that we could say, all right, this is something the American people benefited from. Rory.
Sure, I'll get that started. I think that, there were a lot of areas of functional cooperation in the S&ED, particularly on outcomes that I personally addressed in energy and climate change, but also on space and trade facilitation. So I'll go through some of those areas of functional cooperation, and then Dan and Tiffany can talk a little bit more about the Treasury side of the equation, and also some of the high-level bilateral dialogues, which were less results-oriented in their nature, but were not without value, I think, to the American people and to the U.S.-China relationship as a whole. So functionally, especially in the areas of nuclear technology and clean energy, there were a lot of opportunities for joint research and trade. One area where the U.S. and China that was consistent throughout the outcomes that we studied in the U.S.-China relationship were peaceful uses of nuclear technology. So the US and China have a lot to gain by combining their research efforts on peaceful uses of nuclear technology. We have a lot to gain through nuclear cooperation in general, but obviously this is an area that is incredibly sensitive because most of the research could be considered dual use and a lot of the projects could be considered dual use. So there had to be a dialogue mechanism which met every year to talk about peaceful uses of nuclear technology and to see where the opportunities arose for things like cancer research or facilitating, U.S. corporation nuclear projects inside China. That was one area of functional cooperation that was helped by the S&ED. There were also, incredible efforts at joint research. So one of the most productive outcomes that I studied was the Clean Energy Research Center. And the Clean Energy Research Center was a government-to-government initiative, which included the cooperation of the private sector and funding from the private sector, but got together the US and China's national laboratories, major think tanks and universities to advance energy efficiency research and cooperation. And one of the more surprising aspects, I think, of that particular project was that the Department of Energy, which was running the Clean Energy Research Center, recognized quite early on the potential risk to intellectual property rights of doing joint research between the US and China. And they built into the protocol for the Clean Energy Research Center an IP rights protection protocol that was cited in a 2015 GAO report as particularly effective at addressing the IP issues. So many of the companies, I think a vast majority of the companies that the GAO surveyed said that the Department of Energy could have done no more to protect intellectual property rights. And they found an instance, at least one instance, where that IP protocol was used to resolve an IP dispute. The Clean Energy Research Center produced, I think, an incredible number of patents for new technologies in building efficiency, battery efficiency, clean vehicles, et cetera. There were also a lot of opportunities for trade facilitation. So in many cases on the topic of clean energy, the US technology and US companies had a comparative advantage to selling their products inside China, and the U.S. Trade Development Agency under the S&ED facilitated a number of trade missions to China and reverse trade missions. And this banner of S&ED cooperation created opportunities for U.S. companies in China, where perhaps it was seen as like as a government-led endorsement in some cases. So that the U.S. Companies could circumvent some of the red tape, regulatory issues, et cetera, that can pop up between joint ventures and in selling their products to China. I think there are also, a lot of experience sharing and development of energy and environmental standards. If you follow the progress of the clean energy and environmental conservation projects throughout the S&ED outcomes, it often starts with the U.S. sharing its technical and experiential data on how to create standards for clean energy and climate conservation. And then you see over time, China developing its own standards, in some cases, maybe on vehicle emissions in particular in the period that we studied, and on water conservations, ones that were even more strict than the US standards. And I think there was a fair amount of international cooperation in this functional areas as well. Two things that stand out. The first is that the US and China worked together to convert China's highly enriched uranium plants to low enriched uranium plants, non-weapons grade material at the beginning of the S&ED. And then the two countries took that experience to Africa, where they converted several plants from HEU, highly enriched uranium, to low enriched uranium, reducing the amount of highly enriched weapons grade uranium throughout the world. I think that's a significant international outcome. Second, a lot of those standards that were developed around climate change and conservation led to cooperation that was essential, according to our interviewees, in realizing the Paris Climate Accords. So it was the functional cooperation and trust and relationships that the US and China developed through this S&ED progress that facilitated China's entry into the Paris Climate Accords. And because of China's entry into the Paris Climate Accords, that brought along a fair amount of South and Southeast Asian countries as well. And then I think that I'd also like to highlight some areas of basic governance that were particularly important to protecting U.S. interests. So one example is that the U.S. and China have, just like in nuclear technology, had a relatively hands-off relationship when it comes to space exploration. So space is another area where, there are some dual-use technologies. NASA is prohibited from working with Chinese partners on space, on some areas of space cooperation, but the Department of State was not. And what they found was that NASA and other agencies needed help to find the right Chinese interlocutors to address the issue of satellite collisions. So when the S&ED process started, what the US side had was a fax number they could reach out to if they suspected that there was a upcoming issue with the satellite collision. And oftentimes the faxes would go unanswered. And through the relationships built through the S&ED process, and particularly through the Department of State, the officials were able to convert from a fax machine notification into real-time email notifications. And that helped facilitate, the avoidance of satellite collisions, which I think we can all agree is an essential issue for the two major countries and the two countries with the most satellites out in space to work together on. Another issue of basic governance that came out in our report was radiation detection measures. So the US and China together set up a radiation detection training center in China in order to better screen at ports for radioactive material or for radiated materials. So I think those are areas where, the S&ED facilitated some functional cooperation, and oftentimes between agencies that were not the Department of State and Department of Treasury, but DHS, DOE, and other places. And that those areas of functional cooperations did advance U.S. interests in a significant way. And also, I think, really showed what two major powers can do together, maybe particularly on that HEU to LEU conversion and in the Paris Climate Accords, that is the mark of a mature and functional relationship. And with that, I'll turn it over to my colleagues who can speak a little bit more about some of the other areas of particular success.
Tiffany, you want to go ahead?
Sure. So I can speak a bit more to the bilateral diplomacy aspect of the S&ED. And in particular on the state side, a lot of these outcomes in bilateral diplomacy reflected more high-level strategic principles for both the US and China. So these are less functional than Rory's outcomes, but still valuable. And this is a key theme that ran through our interviews, that these were still valuable, even though the outcomes were not always as tangible. And these outcomes centered on things like statements of principle or dialogues that were held or were to be held. And the value is really centered on advancing mutual understanding between both sides, risk reduction, clarifying intention, identifying interlocutors, reducing the risk of misinterpreting intentions. Something that also came out of these dialogues was that the S&ED set the rhythm for the U.S.-China relationship and kept dialogue going when times of crises arose or times of tension arose. So one interviewee mentioned that the S&ED served as a kind of reset or anchor after the 2014 indictment of PLA officers. So while these less tangible outcomes were emphasized in the interviews, there were also some tangible gains that were included. So in my research in particular, on the state side, I found that there were actually pretty tangible outcomes, especially among law enforcement, consular dialogue, and supply chain security. So on the law enforcement side, China became more willing to crack down on child exploitation crimes, as well as on narcotics control. So China began listing precursor chemicals as controlled substances due to the S&ED. On the consular dialogue side, consular dialogue helped produce reciprocal 10-year validity tourism and business visas, and a 5-year validity student visa program. For supply chain security, dialogue helped to facilitate trade while doing security checks, specifically through customs joint validations, as well as expanding the Container Security Initiative, which is an initiative obviously post 9/11 to secure the supply chain internationally. There were also some MOUs that came out of military to military dialogue, specifically the notification of major military activities MOU, as well as joint exercises that were conducted on both sides. The S&ED also helped to facilitate dialogue around UN peacekeeping. And China actually ended up becoming the biggest contributor of peacekeeping forces of the P5. And S&ED also helped to produce a number of subnational and people-to-people exchange programs. So these were more tangible gains that came out of bilateral dialogue. I also just want to emphasize and touch on a bit of some of the gains of regional dialogues too. So the S&ED featured a number of regional dialogues on the Middle East and Africa, as well as Asia. And coming out of some of these dialogues, the US and China made specific commitments on the Sudan and South Sudan issues. And the Chinese involvement in particular was viewed as constructive, for instance, by participating in conflict mediation between the two sides. Dialogue between the US and China also helped contribute to the Iran deal, as well as counterterrorism dialogue, increasing coordination between the US and China on regional terrorist threats. The two sides also exchanged information on Afghanistan, which also helped to produce 2 cooperation programs between the US and Afghanistan and China on training Afghan diplomats and healthcare workers in both the US and China. And finally, I think it's important to highlight US-China collaboration on Ebola. So China's first major foray into international infectious disease response was on the Ebola issue, in which it sent both medical personnel and constructed response sites in Africa during this disease crisis. And the US and China actually worked together on the ground and in international venues, including the UN, in part due to the S&ED dialogue mechanism. And I think it's important to emphasize this because in light of the COVID-19 pandemic, where many of the cooperative mechanisms are obviously gone prior to the pandemic, so we didn't see as much cooperation as we perhaps might have seen had these cooperative mechanisms still existed. And with that, I'm going to toss it to Dan.
Tiffany, as much might be the understatement of the decade. But you make a great point that the mechanisms that we use to cooperate on fighting Ebola had been wiped out in part because of the cancellation of the S&ED, and therefore when COVID came around, they couldn't kind of form the basis for cooperating on fighting COVID, and it's only gotten worse since. Dan, sorry.
No, actually, Steve, that's a great point, and I think it's sort of a good foray into some of the points I want to make on the Treasury side and highlight a few of the success stories we had over there. I think one of the most potent examples of success that we had on the Treasury side was the cooperation after the 2008 financial crisis. I think it's certainly possible to talk about the cooperation that took place during the crisis. And in fact, that's a really important aspect of it, but obviously that was beyond the scope of the S&ED and was during the Bush era. But a couple of former officials noted that, the crisis required consistent communication and that it would have been really difficult or really easy, I should say, for each side to misinterpret one another and how they were responding to the crisis. And so to your point, Steve, about how necessary this is to start before a crisis begins. And I think in my mind, I do worry that what happens if there is another financial crisis and there is no dialogue mechanism to carry out that communication. So one highlight in the years after the crisis was cooperation on macroeconomic stability. China committed to a number of things, including to increase domestic consumption, and it did so by 6 percentage points by the end of the S&ED. The U.S., for its part, committed to increase national and private savings and sought long-term fiscal sustainability through things like healthcare reform. But just to give you a flavor of the other commitments that China made during this time, they included things like increasing household income, promoting job creation, accelerating development of the service sector, speeding up reform of monopolies, increasing access to financing for small and medium-sized enterprises, and expanding things like rural pension programs. And in my analysis, China fulfilled all of these commitments with the possible exception of job creation, as I think unemployment increased over the course of the S&ED in China. But just pulling one of those examples out, I think it's a really good example of sort of the long-term trajectory of these commitments, was the commitment made to reform or speed up reforms of monopolies. China committed in a number of S&ED statements to sort of build off of its 2008 anti-monopoly law. And throughout the S&ED, they made incremental progress. And I think what's really telling is that in 2019, China created the Chinese State Administration for Market Regulations, which carried much more enforcement power than previous agencies. So this demonstrated that even after the S&ED was finished, there was a sort of momentum to some of these commitments that carried forth in the years that followed. Some other surprising progress that I'll just highlight very quickly included things like data and regulation transparency. China committed and made several improvements to some practices on data transparency. China committed to improving procedures for its state capital operational budget. And by the end of the S&ED, reports were more detailed and lengthier, including indicating a greater willingness to share information. And in 2018, I think this is important to note that IMF reported China had partially met its commitments to improve government financial statistics. So there was room for improvement there, but they were making some improvements. So just a quick word to expand on Rory's comments on intellectual property. I think counter to popular perception, there was some surprising progress in IP protections. And I think this could be a very lengthy conversation, but just to make a couple points, the USTR noted significant improvements in 2015 stemming from their commitments made at the S&ED. The USTR stated in its 301 report, which sort of looks at global IP protections, that that there were better means of seeking injunctive relief in China, and that the US and China increased law enforcement cooperation on cross-border infringements. So I think that's significant. Some participants also noted that China's interest on IP protection increased along with their domestic innovation. And I think that's a trend that you see in most economies. And so it may and will likely continue to increase in the future. And in 2016, you'll remember that there was a lot of concern with China's excess steel capacity. And in 2016, the S&ED joint statement centered a lot around China's steel capacity. So I just want a quick word on that. China did take steps on all its commitments to reduce steel production, though it may have fell short of what some US stakeholders would have hoped for. Nonetheless, they did reduce capacity by about 120 metric tons. So that's just a quick flavor of the Treasury outcomes. And I think I can just sort of end here and get into the Q&A if that's okay.
So you've touched on a lot of what's in the report. It makes a compelling case that there were real benefits to the global system and Americans. So let me turn to Susan Thornton and say, okay, you were in government when this collapsed. What happened? When you have this, again, this is open source stuff. This is not unknown. What happened?
Well, thanks, Steve. And again, thanks to the National Committee on U.S. China Relations for doing this. I mean, collapse is maybe not quite the right word. I mean, I think what happened was we had the strategic and economic dialogue that was set up by the Obama administration. And then we had, of course, a change of administration in the US. Most administrations coming in like to tinker at the margins with, how they set up relationships, processes, other things. They like to change the names, et cetera. And I think, starting out under the Trump administration, there was a lot of effort that went into thinking about how we would structure dialogues with the Chinese. And if you'll remember, Secretary Rex Tillerson talked about having these 4 high-level dialogues, one on security issues, one on economic issues, one on people-to-people exchange, et cetera, and then military dialogues. And I think, that was the original intent over the course of the first, I would say, sort of year of the Trump administration to set up these dialogues. And they did actually meet, I think, 1 round, but there was a real aversion to, a lot of things in the Trump administration, right? And one of them was basically to a lot of bureaucratic government involvement in any issue. Never mind, the issues relating to China. So I think the preference was to have a sort of a top-down dialogue, together, and sort of more mirroring the Chinese system, the top-down dialogue. Of course, the only dialogue that ended up actually progressing and producing anything was the economic dialogue that included Robert Lighthizer and Liu He, and the other dialogues fell apart for various and sundry reasons, but certainly not the least of which was the revolving door in the personnel system in the Trump administration. So I think that, is a more or less explanation of kind of how things proceeded there. But we did see the high-level economic dialogue, of course, continue and produce a trade agreement that was signed exactly, a week before the COVID pandemic basically broke out and Wuhan City was shut down. And that, I think, event changed the course of U.S.-Chinese relations over the last couple of years.
That leads directly into a question which any of you could answer, which kind of we made reference to. But so, the Lighthizer-Liu He dialogue was really, even, I guess it started out trying to deal with structural issues, but quickly devolved into how do we best satisfy domestic constituencies in the United States with the trade deal. So it wasn't a real strategic discussion of economic issues. But the question is, since it did ultimately result in the signing of an agreement, and given the enormous effort that goes into an S&ED, don't these things occur anyhow? If left, the State Department can run its own strategic dialogue. Treasury can run, discussions. USTR can run discussions. Commerce can run discussions. Why is it worth it? How do you justify it?
I could take an initial stab at this, and I'd love to hear what some of the people who did the research in the trenches thought about this issue. But, I think the US has a very bottom-up system, as somebody mentioned earlier on. We have a lot of interest groups. Almost anything in the universe is going to be at issue in the US-China relationship. So you have more interest groups and more issues coming up in the relationship maybe than you do between any other 2 countries out there. And so I think, the US does have a problem with prioritization, and it is important to have a mechanism to try to have some coordination in the US government. And I think the S&ED was very important for that. Now, it does create some tension because, of course, agencies don't like to bend to the priorities of either higher ups or of other agencies. And it's really hard to do that coordination in the US government. But if you don't do it, then it's much easier for a top-down system like the Chinese system to play different channels off one another. And I think it's very important to try to have good coordination, not to limit the number of issues we address, not to trade issues off against each other. And I think there might be some comments from the group on that particular criticism, but to make sure that we do have some prioritization and some coordination when we're approaching a negotiating team that's as formidable as the Chinese negotiating team is, and they're quite skilled. So we have to be as good as they are.
Others want to comment on that?
Better. We have to be better than they are.
Yeah, I think that, just to complement what Susan has said quite eloquently, that there is a sense, I think, in the criticism of the process that the S&ED was, it was like a bicycle. It kept running of its own accord, even though the logic of the process was flawed. But I think it's more accurate to look at it as a ballast in the relationship. And one data point that we can glean from the study of the outcomes is that as general dissatisfaction with Chinese political system in the US grew over the time of the S&ED, so as China's political system, became more repressive domestically, as China's power grew and it challenged US interests more formidably in the international system or in regional fora, the areas of cooperation in the S&ED and other places also grew. So I think that this process was really effective at compartmentalizing our different issues. And it's saying there are places where the US and China are never going to agree, and we need to manage those issues, and we need to do that maturely and directly and frankly. But also there are all these areas of common ground, and we're not trading off one issue for another. We can simultaneously have cooperation and competition and at times, friction or areas to manage in the relationship. And all of those things can be trending at the exact same time. So I think the process itself was really effective at compartmentalizing issues. And that's one argument for bringing a process back beyond just the prioritization. When you have this action forcing mechanism, when you have this high level buy-in, you do create momentum for keeping the process going, even when other aspects of current relations or current events could potentially get in the way. So another argument for process is that it does effectively compartmentalize issues, and that has been a stated goal of U.S.-China relations over the last 9 months.
Just to add to what's been said, I think the US and China systems are very different, as came out in interviews, and a lot of issues cross-cut different agencies on both sides. So by having an S&ED-like structure, you're not only reducing the administrative burden, but it also helps to identify who the correct people are to talk to, build relationships over time so that you can continue to talk to the right people. And I think also, especially for the Chinese system, the role of high-level officials is very important. So once they indicated support of progress on a particular issue, this empowered low-level officials to make progress and enter agreements, which might not happen without the high-level sign-off.
Tiffany, you mentioned the MOUs that were signed in the military area. What DoD would tell you today is they've never been properly implemented. That it was great that they got signed, but they just sit there. The Chinese don't notify us of these things. They've just chosen to ignore it. So should we have these kinds of dialogues if when agreements are reached, they're ignored?
So I would say that this gets into a bit of one of our policy recommendations, which is to clarify the outcomes, what's agreed to in a specific dialogue, versus the outputs over time. And there are definitely certain dialogues where there were outcomes that were agreed to that were not fully implemented. But then there are other outcomes that were implemented over time. And I think it's worth tracking where the failures to implement are and what the successes were, even in terms of helping to prioritize what issues are worth continuing to dialogue in the future.
Yeah, one of the benefits, of course, of the S&ED is when we did include the military, it did create a pathway for our militaries to have meetings at a very senior level. If you look at today, those meetings are not occurring at all. So we're not having a dialogue with the Chinese military. Our military is not having a dialogue with the Chinese military. So if we had an S&ED, it least it would be a date certain by which they needed to meet. If you had these at fixed dates every year, it would be a way to keep that conversation going.
I would just say, Steve, you know, one of the military agreements that was reached in the context of the S&ED was the agreement on the rules of behavior, which is a very, I think, has been implemented and is probably one of the major reasons why we haven't had you know, kind of very escalatory military incident in the close in waters around you know, East Asia, Southeast Asia, where we have so many military assets moving around in close proximity. So that's one, and I think that, you know, the notification of major military exercises may not have been implemented. It was reached late at the very end of the process, and relations kind of deteriorated quickly following. But that rules of behavior memorandum, I think, has held up fairly well, even after the S&ED finished. So these, I mean, there are a lot of different things to look at, but I think that was a significant one.
The Biden administration has talked about values being the center of our foreign policy now. At one point in time, the S&ED had both a human rights dialogue and a legal experts dialogue, which seemed to me a great idea. Some complained that it gave legitimacy to the Chinese, that they said, you see, we have these human rights dialogues. I actually think it's the precise opposite, that when you sit and talk about human rights with the Chinese government and talk about it in terms of international conventions, they take voluminous notes, and those notes circulate throughout the Chinese government, the Ministry of Public Affairs, the Ministry of Public Security, you know, Ministry of State Security, and those who are pro kind of rule of law in those areas. They see what the Americans, it actually gives them hope that one day China will move in that kind of think about dialogue in the S&ED, because we think about it, National Committee on U.S China. We actually do dialogue with the Human Rights Development Foundation on human rights, rule of law. So I think about those issues often.
I think, Steve, your microphone was breaking up a little bit, but I think we got the question. And there was someone that did actually do the research on the human rights dialogue. I don't know if any of the three of you can speak to what they found.
So I did a little bit of the research on the human rights dialogue. And I would say that the point I would make from, based on my interviews, is that one, the main point of the S&ED was not actually to achieve system change. It was more about influencing how China engages with the international community. But two, the importance of the human rights dialogue was as an educational process, so that both sides could learn more about how each other's systems worked and how to better engage with each other's systems. In addition to, again, this theme that comes up of identifying the correct interlocutors. I also found from at least one interview that another benefit of the human rights dialogue was the opportunity to pass along, for the US side to pass along to the China side, certain human rights cases of concern, issues that the US side, that they would like the China side to deal with. And we personally did not find any evidence of horse trading on these issues. So, for instance, we didn't see where the U.S. was giving China space on a human rights record just to secure cooperation on climate change, for instance. I have heard this critique that by having the dialogue that the U.S. is legitimizing the China narrative on human rights. I just don't see any evidence of that. I don't think that's the case. I don't think that's what actually happened through dialogue.
One of the things which is not in the report, but I believe is is a result of the S&ED is the release of Cheng Guangcheng. That he was released because the Chinese and Secretary Clinton needed to resolve these issues before the S&ED started. So because we had these high-level meetings, there was a need to kind of make sure this kind of issue didn't devolve in kind of a Fang Lijie, the physicist who was held in the U.S. Embassy for how long? So 13 months? Yeah. 14, I mean, a long time. It could have devolved into that. Instead, he was released and allowed to come to NYU to study. It's not an actual result of the S&ED, but it actually happened because of the S&ED. And when you have regular senior meetings, and it's true in business and it's true in diplomacy, you're forced to do things prior to those meetings that you likely would not have done otherwise.
Yeah, I think that gets to two issues, right? It's the action forcing nature of having this regular process and scheduled meetings. And it's also the relationships that get built in the process. If you have a pandemic and you haven't ever met your opposite number in person, you're not going to have the same relationship as you do if you're meeting with them constantly through these kind of processes to try to move issues forward. People might get frustrated over like those frequent meetings and how long it takes. But I mean, honestly, that is the nature of diplomacy. You have to work on issues that are very knotty sometimes, and it takes a long time. And there's a lot of education that goes on during these negotiations about what the constraints are that both sides face and what is the realistic ground on which we can sort of land and come up with an outcome. And I think that is the heart of diplomacy. And the process kind of with China is, it takes a lot of investment. So, I mean, we shouldn't be naive about that we can only just, go over and have one meeting with China and get an outcome. That's not going to be the way it works. And frankly, it's not the way it works with most countries.
Yeah. The one final question to Susan, and I want to take all these great questions I'm getting from the audience. What should we expect the Biden administration to do in this area? As it's obviously part of kind of the U.S. China relationship generally, but can we expect the Biden administration to do more? Obviously, President Biden and President Xi had a conversation on Thursday night that was portrayed as a strategic discussion. Should we expect more in this regard? Should we expect recreation of some dialogues?
I mean, yes, I think absolutely we should expect recreation of some dialogues because it's going to be absolutely necessary, I think, going forward. We already have the creation of a dialogue basically between special envoys for climate change. And John Kerry was, of course, in China last week and met with his counterpart Xie Zhenhua in Tianjin. And they have been keeping a very kind of frequent communication channel going. And I assume that they will continue to do that up until the COP26 in December and beyond. But I think in parallel to that, we will see the gradual establishment of regular channels on other issues because it's going to end up being absolutely necessary that we do so. I know that in the phone call, that President Biden had with President Xi, he alluded to this idea of, setting guardrails so that our stiff competition doesn't get out of hand. And I think that speaks to the issue of having more frequent interactions between our militaries and discussions about arms control and limiting dangers in new technologies and new weapon systems. I think that will probably be something that gets going eventually. I hope so. And I think there will be dialogues in other areas, consular issues. With the pandemic, there are so many issues with travel and exchanges. There will have to be some of these dialogues will be, I think, certainly reestablished based on the interests that the U.S. has with China, which are sweeping and profound. And I don't think, that anyone can really imagine that these things are going to get done just on their own without the two sides talking to one another. So certainly we will see some kind of reestablishment. I think it will be slow and organic because we have to face the fact that, you know, the political situation around the U.S.-China relationship has definitely changed, that the overall sort of deterioration of the relationship is going to make it difficult, and all of the things that we do with China are now subject to, depending on your view, you know, overdue or unreasonable scrutiny. So I think we will have to see how things go forward, but certainly the dialogues are going to be necessary, and they will have to be set up, I think.
Does this study of the S&ED lead you to conclude that the United States should have what I would call a China czar, someone who could break through the silos of commerce, treasury, justice, defense, state, homeland security, and kind of, or do we have existing positions that can deal with it?
Yeah, I'm not a fan of a China czar, because I think, frankly, that the president of the United States is going to have to take an active hand in relations with China. And he's really the only person that has the kind of strategic vision and overview over all of the agencies that will be able to really know what the foundation of U.S.-China relations should be aimed at, what we should be going for, what the overall goal should be. And I think, you know, trying to have someone else other than that will make things confusing for lower levels. But certainly the National Security Advisor plays an incredibly important role, the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense. And I think, you know, there's a work ongoing on this China policy for the Biden administration. And hopefully we will have that kind of high level guidance coming out from the administration soon.
Certainly the creation of a new job at the National Security Council, now filled by Kurt Campbell, above Senior Director but below National Security Advisor, was to some degree a recognition of that need. Let's get to some of the questions. First one is from Richard Erstad, who asks, how might civil society groups bolster China-US cooperation on tackling climate change? What are best issues to focus on where a real contribution might result? We could do a full program on that, so limit your answer to make it brief. Whoever wants to take that.
I'll take it since I worked on some of the climate change outcomes in the S&ED. Although I have to stress that, you know, our report and our data mostly dealt with government to government. And while civil society was actively encouraged to participate in these mechanisms and in the projects that the government set up, it did require, I think, a government-led directives, particularly on the part of China, where, as many people who, you know, work on U.S.-China relations know, civil society is more constrained, particularly in areas of international cooperation. But I think that there are a lot of different joint research projects that civil society actors could contribute to. I think that there were several areas of people-to-people exchange that were useful in coming to common ground on climate change. You know, one is that we had a Sister Lakes program, and we had several Sister Cities programs that were working on things like clean energy efficiency projects in cities or conservation efforts. We had, you know, cooperation between our national parks to talk about conservation efforts, and between, you know, zoos to work on habitat preservation. So I think those are all areas in which civil society groups could lend a hand in advocating to the governments that there are significant areas of progress to be found on those issues. And then I would also say that inside international institutions, there's a lot of room for civil society actors to lend expertise, particularly technical expertise. So the US and China cooperate in the international system on climate change, including through APEC and organizations that are regional in focus, particularly on deforestation and habitat preservation. but also in the UN and again, like with regard to major multinational agreements such as the Paris Climate Accord. So those are all areas I think that civil society could help jumpstart cooperation. And it's really just about building the case that the benefit of working with China, the US working with China and China working with the US on some of these issues really outweighs the risks that, you know, some people would identify in terms of intellectual property rights or other areas of, you know, private sector competition. So that is where I think civil society can be most effective and should concentrate its efforts.
Great. Monica Hood at Amgen asked, one key aspect of the S&ED was the appointment of a presidential envoy from China, which gave it high-level cover. Given the current hyper-nationalistic dynamic in China, do you think China would be willing to engage at a high level while compartmentalizing these issues without bringing in the politics? Anybody want to take a stab at that one?
Well, I'll take a stab at it. I mean, I do think that the U.S. China relationship is extremely important to the Chinese leadership. I think that is generally acknowledged inside the Chinese government. And so I think if the US showed a willingness to engage in a broad spectrum, you know, range of discussions like this, that the Chinese would be willing to appoint someone. I think the problem, and we see it having emerged again in the phone call last week between the two presidents, is that there's a sense that the relationship is in such bad shape that something will need to be done to sort of improve, you know, the overall relationship before we could launch into a kind of a concrete full spectrum discussion on various areas of collaboration. But I think if we got there, the Chinese would certainly be willing to appoint a requisite official in order to make it a smooth process.
It's a great answer. Let me, I'm sure we've got just a very few minutes left. And there's one question. If you had kind of just 60 seconds with President Biden, based upon this, you have to make an elevator pitch to him based upon this study. What would each of you tell him to do? Anybody want to do an elevator pitch?
Come on, Dan.
Yeah, no, I'll take a stab at that. And I haven't worked on my elevator pitch, so I guess this is good practice. But you know, I think that there's multiple takeaways as we covered earlier on. And I think one of the key aspects of this is the bridging gaps between our systemic differences here. And I think, you know, the call with Biden and Xi Jinping earlier, or last week, I should say, really pointed to that. I think he wanted to see if the leadership level discussions could do what the lower level engagements couldn't do. But as we pointed out here, we need sort of both in order to address systemic differences, right? So we need a process that can handle both of those things. And I also think that, you know, we're going to have a process in which can successfully compartmentalize these issues. I think there is a little bit of an issue in terms of how much engagement China is giving the US in terms of climate change. And I think that that's problematic in so many different ways. And so we need a mechanism that can start to sort of address the full suite of issues between the US and China. So I don't know how I did there, but I didn't time myself. But I'll give it another go if I get another chance.
Anybody else? If this were venture capital, if this was venture capital contest, this would be required. So, Rory?
Sure. I mean, I'll make some additional points. Maybe this elevator is going up a very tall building and we all get 30 or 60 seconds to add to this pitch. But I would say that, you know, it is important to understand what the rest of the world expects from a U.S.-China relationship. And I think the rest of the world expects that the U.S. and China can have a mature and functional relationship. And the way to get to a mature and functional relationship is to have increased contacts among our working level officials. And I think that, you know, there's plenty of very prominent voices in the US foreign policy community and in the global foreign policy community that say that, you know, we cannot compromise anything that is important to us with regard to China. But I think that there is a definitely a quieter but majority of the rest of the countries that do not want to be forced to choose between the US and China, that do not want to see US China competition split the world up into separate economic systems or spheres of influence, and that we have to be realistic that we live in this global ecosystem and we should do our best to serve it well. And that is how we retain our global leadership, not through trying to outcompete each other.
Tiffany.
I'll just add a bit by saying there is no progress without process, and we can't, as Rory was saying, expect to have a mature relationship without constant communication and building those relationships over time. I would also say that having an S&ED-like structure or having regular talks does not mean that there is no competition in other areas. But this helps to structure competition and helps to make progress on issues where there are common interests, where we don't actually want tensions in other area to impede progress in these areas.
Susan, last but certainly not least.
I thought they said it great. I think having communication between the United States and China is absolutely imperative for making progress on so many issues that are at the top of both our respective agendas, economic prosperity, overcoming the downturn following the pandemic, cooperation on the pandemic itself, cooperation on climate change and other ecological problems, cooperation on countering extremism and terrorism. There's so many things that now are not in the state-on-state competition basket, but are these are problems for both of us, and we both can bring something to the table to try to help the world cope with them. And I think that, as Rory said, is what the world expects, and it's very important. I mean, even between the US and close allies like the Europeans, like Japan and Korea, we have to do a lot of communicating and coordinating. So you can imagine that it's even more important with a country that, with which we have a very different system, and in many cases, different views and different interests in some areas. And so the communication is I think, more important, certainly for signaling intentions, for making sure that we understand what's happening and that we avoid conflict ultimately is, of course, the most important thing. But we can make progress on a lot of issues at the same time.
This has been a wonderful panel. We allocated an hour and 15 minutes, which has turned out to be far too short. But I think we've given the listeners a flavor for what is in the report, Engagement Revisited. And it really has to be read, because the narrative that exists today in Washington is that engagement has failed and the S&EDs failed. One can reach that conclusion, but you gotta look at the data and see if it is supported by the data. I would argue if you go in with an open mind and you read this report, you begin to rethink whether engagement failed or not. You begin to rethink whether these dialogues had real deliverables for the American people. And I think what you have all done have laid out a clear case that should cause the Biden administration, help cause the Biden administration to reevaluate these decisions on many of these dialogues. And what we saw the president do on Thursday night, I believe, was the beginning of that process. But thank you all for a wonderful, interesting discussion. The link to the report is in the chat. It's also on the National Committee on American Foreign Policy website if you want to look at it there. I guess this takes you to the website, so that's easy to do. But thank you all so much, and thank you all for joining us this afternoon.